1829. A dense fog hugs the coastline as lantern light flickers in a lonely Delmarva tavern. Beneath the floorboards, muffled cries rise from hidden cells, free black families desperate for refuge, slaves daring a final flight to liberty. They believed they'd found safety. They were wrong. Patty Cannon's sun-bleached smile and poison, stained hands had been hunting them for years, turning hope into horror, every promise of shelter into a trap. Tonight, she'll come calling again on the reverse Underground Railroad, and no prayer, no firewall of good intentions, will stand between her and her next victim. Born Lucretia Patricia Hanley circa 1760 in the rolling tobacco fields of Caroline County, Maryland, she arrived into a world defined by plantation rows, enslaved labor, and the hush of the Chesapeake Bay's tidal breath. Her family, modest tenant farmers scraping a living from tobacco and corn, provided little more than subsistence and a rudimentary education in the rudiments of arithmetic and the etiquette of polite society. Even for white children of humble means, schooling was irregular, lessons delivered by itinerant teachers who arrived only in fair weather and sparingly. Yet her keen intellect and restless curiosity set her apart early on. She delighted in stories the neighbors told by lantern-light tales of pirate hideaways on Tangier Sound, rumors of escaped slaves forging secret paths through swamps, and whispers of patriot plots during the Revolutionary War. Those narratives, brimming with danger and defiance, seeped into her imagination and kindled ambitions far beyond the log cabin of her youth. In her adolescence, Lucretia Patricia Hanley began to chafe against the narrow expectations of rural womanhood. She learned needlework and household management, staples for any Virginia girl of her station, but also mastered the art of conversation, a skill honed through countless afternoons in the shade of a walnut tree, listening to itinerant preachers and drunks exchanging confidences on their rounds. She watched her mother barter with traveling merchants, noting how a sharp question or a well-timed compliment could secure a better price for livestock or grain. These exchanges taught her power lay not just in wealth, but in words and perception. Neighbors later recalled her possessive gaze on the passing traders, her speculative glint when they whispered of markets as far off as New Orleans or Charleston. Around her 18th year, Lucretia married John Cannon, sometimes spelled Cannon, a carpenter of middling prosperity whose heart, by some accounts, belonged more to rum and brawls than to his bride. Their union moved her to a modest tavern he purchased near the heart of the Delmarva Peninsula, an isthmus that stretched from Delaware to Virginia, threaded by creeks and rivers, a crossroads for sailors, farmers, and wanderers. The tavern faced what was then a main road connecting rural plantations to ports on the Sassafras and Nanticoke rivers. Gray plank walls bore the brunt of bay winds, a stoop served as stage for traveling fiddlers, and the basement smelled of damp earth and aged barrels. This tavern would become her crucible, the vessel by which she remade herself from Lucretia Hanley into a figure whispered about in both dread and fascination, Patty Cannon. As Patty, she donned a persona both inviting and inscrutable. By day she presided over the taproom, pouring cider for farmers and offering bread and cheese to weary travelers. She smiled with an easy warmth, inquired after family health, and collected local gossip as deftly as she collected coins. With her fair hair tucked beneath a coonskin cap and her lilac skirts sweeping the floor, she cultivated the image of a kindly innkeeper. Yet beneath this amiable facade lurked a calculating mind. She studiously noted each newcomer's accents, each rumor of bounty on runaway slaves or free black families seeking safer harbors north of the Mason-Dixon line. In the lull between afternoon and dusk, she conferred in hushed tones with her husband and a small cadre of trusted associates, men like Joe Johnson and Bill G., plotting routes and rendezvous points for the grim enterprise soon to be known as the Reverse Underground Railroad. The Delmarva Peninsula's winding waterways and dense marshes made it an ideal theater for clandestine operations. Barges could slip quietly down creeks to waiting skiffs, avoiding the watchful eyes of patrols. Fords and ferries offered natural choke points where captives, often tricked with promises of shelter, work, or freedom, could be corralled without alarm. Patty Cannon's Tavern sat at the junction of these paths. Beneath its creaking floorboards lay a hidden cellar low, ceilinged, windowless, lined with iron rings for binding, and echoing with the muffled pleas of those trapped within. Here, free black families and escaped slaves were held in cramped quarters, given only stale water and half rations, the clang of a distant lantern lock their only signal of waking or sleep. Word of her cruelty was whispered among the enslaved communities like a cautionary fable. Better to face a whipping than the suffocating terror of Patty's basement. She leveraged her knowledge of local politics and prejudices with uncanny cunning. In the early 1820s, calls for stricter enforcement of fugitive slave laws stirred fear among free black communities. Officials agreed to deputize local citizens to root out runaways, and unpaid rewards steeled the resolve of those willing to betray neighbors for $20 apiece. Patty became the trusted intermediary. She notified magistrates of suspicious persons, guiding them to isolated homesteads where unsuspecting refugees and their allies sheltered. She then rescued these captives from the magistrate's custody, claiming to be their rightful owner or relative, only to funnel them south in secret coffles. Through bribery and intimidation of lawmen, she ensured her ring's operations remained shielded from scrutiny. When any local official grew too curious, he either vanished during a journey to retrieve evidence or was rumored to have met a sudden, inexplicable demise by arsenic, arranged by Patty herself, if some accounts are accurate. As her gang's influence grew, so did her empire of fear. The tavern's respectable lantern, lit facade, obscured a labyrinth of secret passages, false walls, and hidden caches of chains and manacles. Even her husband, the carpenter, played a role, modifying floors and supporting beams to conceal crawl spaces wide enough for a man to squeeze through, passages that wound beneath the highway and spilled out at riverbank docks, where waited to carry their cargo toward Charleston or Mobile. Paddy calls and shouts of greetings signaled to riverboat captains that their human commodities were en route. Nightly, under the cover of a heavy fog blown in off the bay, Patty Cannon watched the horizon for those boats, her lantern reflecting in lantern-lit windows like a silent beacon summoning the dead and the doomed. Yet the reinvention from Lucretia Hanley to Patty Cannon required more than superficial costume. She honed a merciless reputation, one that stretched from Wycomico to Dorchester counties. She leveraged rumors of her viciousness, whispered legends that she once dropped a bound black woman into the chimney and later discovered only scattered ashes, to terrify potential dissenters. Local families of color lived in perpetual fear. Any stranger who offered work or safe passage might be Patty in disguise. Even trusted abolitionists avoided the tavern, sending silent warnings to congregations to steer clear of the white-haired innkeeper whose stage whispers promised aid, but whose basement promised only chains and auction blocks. Reinvention also meant remaking the story of her own life. She spread tall tales about coming from a genteel background, the grand plantation of her fictional father south of Salisbury, claiming education in city schools and acquaintance with prominent families. Letters were circulated, bearing a forged signature of her, Patty Jameson, praising her hospitality and discreetness to would-be clientele. By controlling the narrative, she insulated her true origins and shielded her from inquiry. When boundary disputes arose over tavern property lines, she produced counterfeit deeds and affidavits, pressing claim to the land in ways that dissuaded honest farmers from challenging her. She was, by all accounts, a skilled autocrat of the small domain she had created. Still, reinvention cannot conceal every truth. Rumors eventually reached Philadelphia, where a coalition of abolitionists, free black activists, and city officials began to piece together reports of missing persons from Eastern Shore counties. They described a ghostly woman whose tavern dinners always held the finest cakes and cheeses, yet whose guests sometimes disappeared only to reappear months later in slave markets with new faces and new collars. Suspicions crystallized around Patty Cannon's establishment. Women like Passwaters and Thompson testified before city councils, describing houses lost to the marsh, and friends seized under the guise of arrest. Newspapers printed her portrait. a weathered face framed by wisps of white hair, eyes narrowed as though sizing up the worth of a stray mule, and dubbed her mistress of the reverse railroad. Patty's transformation from humble farmer's daughter to ruthless kidnapper hinged on her mastery of perception and fear. She employed code words, Uriah's promise, midnight harvest, to direct her agents. She memorized the names of local school teachers and county sheriffs, using them to cloak her letters of credit as genuine orders. She treated captives with a veneer of civility, speaking softly to lull them into believing they would be cared for, before locking them in dank cells or parading them toward awaiting slave coffles. Her reinvention was so complete that some local white neighbors insisted such brutality could not spring from one of their own, instead pointing fingers at out-of-town gamblers or seafaring brigands. Only the most diligent investigators connected the dots and confronted Patty with witness accounts and receipts for coffle expenses traced to her tavern's ledger. By 1829, decades after her first forays into human trafficking, the name Lucretia Harnley had faded from local memory, eclipsed by the legend of Patty Cannon, the woman who lured free people into bondage and sold them south for profit. She had succeeded in erasing her past and embedding herself into the darkest underbelly of America's slave economy. Yet her reinvention carried seeds of its own undoing. As networks of abolitionists grew bolder, as anti-slavery pamphlets spread among freedmen in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, her carefully pruned identity became the thread connecting disparate testimonies. Maps were drawn tracing routes from Maryland's eastern shore through Delaware's hidden roads, always converging at Patty Cannon's Tavern. Men and women from Baltimore to Philadelphia recognized her photograph pinned to wanted posters, combustible fuel for the manhunt her reinvention had unwittingly sparked. In essence, her rebirth from Lucretia Patricia Hanley into Patty Cannon was a transformation of narrative, geography, and psyche. She turned a simple tavern into a fortress of vice and terror, harnessing local fears and national anxieties about fugitive slaves to cement her power. She traded in identities, forged marks on documents, false names on passports, whispered rumors among county clerks, to obscure her true origins, even as she mastered the trafficking of others' identities through bondage. The cabin girl turned innkeeper became a legend of cruelty precisely because she understood the power of reinvention to reshape history, to rewrite law, and to transform the hope of liberation into nightmare captivity. In so doing, she turned Caroline County's dusty byways into a nexus of dread that haunted the memory of an entire region long after her own life and original name were all but forgotten. From the moment the first rumors circulated in 1820 of a mysterious kidnapping ring operating along the Delmarva Peninsula, Patty Cannon's name became inseparable from the clandestine enterprise known today as the Reverse Underground Railroad. What most Southern planters and Northern abolitionists scarcely grasped was that Cannon never worked alone. By the early 1820s, she had forged a ruthless partnership with John P. Johnson, a mixed-race former slave-turned-enforcer, and together they organized a network capable of abducting thousands. This was neither a spur-of-the-moment operation nor a haphazard band of opportunists. It was a coordinated, multi-racial criminal cartel whose reach stretched from the swamps of Maryland to the slave markets of New Orleans. In an age when runaway advertisements dotted every courthouse and thousands fled plantations seeking freedom in the North, Cannon and Johnson inverted the logic of escape, hunting not fugitives of wartime enslavement, but free black citizens and escaped bondservants alike, ensnaring them in a system designed to profit from human misery. The Cannon-Johnson partnership emerged from a chance encounter in the mid-Atlantic taverns where trade caravans paused en route to port towns. Lucretia Patty Cannon, recently widowed and possessing an easy command of local gossip, had inherited her husband's roadside inn on a desolate stretch of road between Georgetown and Salisbury. John Johnson, a light-skinned man born into bondage, but freed by sale in Philadelphia, drifted south with connections in both free black communities and clandestine slave markets. He recognized in Cannon not merely a savvy businesswoman, but someone with the resources and audacity to orchestrate large-scale abductions. Cannon, in turn, saw in Johnson a means to navigate the contradictions of her territory. He could pass among free black enclaves without arousing white suspicion, and his knowledge of the roads allowed the gang to exploit hidden byways. By 1821, their gang boasted a cadre of perhaps 24 regular associates, farmers with a taste for easy money, runaway slaves lured by promises of new identities, and even impoverished white mechanics eager to supplement meager wages. Each member had a defined role. Cannon's Tavern served as a front. Weary travelers who paused at her hearth were recorded in a ledger, their sobriquet and physical description filed away. Johnson's role was to scout for potential harvests of human livestock, masquerading as a sympathetic drifter who offered safe passage north. Other accomplices maintained hidden cells beneath the tavern floor, stockpiling lengths of chain and heavy iron manacles obtained from decommissioned prisons. When a target was identified, a family of free black yard workers heading north with valid papers, a solitary fugitive sheltered on a nearby farm, the gang set its plan into motion with military precision. Abductions often began innocently. A sharp knock at the door might announce a friendly messenger bearing urgent work for a skilled coachman or farmhand. In some cases, runaway fugitives were enticed by the prospect of forged certificates of freedom in exchange for a small fee, only to find themselves shackled below the floorboards once they had surrendered the cash. Families were separated under the guise of taking affidavits at the nearest magistrate's office, but instead of protective custody, they were shackled and loaded onto drays bound for the stagecoach inns where Johnson's agents awaited. Word of mouth was the gang's lifeblood. Every informant was paid in silver, and discretion was enforced by threats of violence or worse, arsenic-laced whiskey cocktails that removed a loose-lipped neighbor from competition. Once captured, individuals, sometimes entire families, were marched south under guard in long coffles. The captives moved with their ankles bound, feet dragging through mud and marsh until open water loomed and small sloops ferried them to coastal ports. There, under the cover of night, they were transferred to larger vessels headed for New Orleans or Mobile. Some vessels flew false flags, smuggling human cargo alongside barrels of tobacco and indigo. Boats' manifests were doctored to record livestock rather than people, enabling the cargo to slip past checkpoints with minimal scrutiny. Prices were negotiated in the slave markets. A man in his prime might fetch $1,000, a child half that. Every dollar rolled back north, enriching Cannon and Johnson in a macabre reversal of the Underground Railroad's philanthropy. Estimates place the total number abducted by the gang at nearly 3,000 between 1820 and 1829. This staggering figure marks one of the most successful human trafficking operations in antebellum America, yet contemporary records remain fragmentary, destroyed by Cannon's orders or lost in the chaos of rural county archives. Newspapers in Philadelphia and Baltimore printed lurid tales of vanished families, while abolitionist societies published broadside warnings against traveling unaccompanied. Still, official investigations were stymied by local complicity. Many county sheriffs received bribes to look the other way. Judges quietly dismissed cases for lack of evidence. Slaves pressed into service as haulers and ferrymen rarely lived long enough to testify, falling victim to disease or violent punishments meted out by Johnson's henchmen. The gang's multi-racial composition both empowered and protected their enterprise. White members provided the veneer of legal authority. Black members offered knowledge of hidden routes and community safe houses. Johnson himself served as a liaison to Quaker sympathizers under false pretenses, gathering intelligence on abolitionist meetings that herded escapees northward. When free black families formed vigilant committees to escort vulnerable neighbors, Johnson infiltrated them, offering to supply proof of freedom papers that actually bore Cannon's forged seals and false addresses. These papers allowed the victims to pass near watchtowers and ferries unmolested until they were handed over to waiting kidnappers. Such betrayal sowed terror among free black enclaves that had once trusted their own networks to protect them. Economics drove the enterprise as much as racism. Southern plantations expanding into Alabama's Black Belt needed labor, and American domestic markets offered higher returns than European buyers. Cannon and Johnson exploited this demand. They contracted with New Orleans factors who issued promissory notes redeemable at banks in Maryland, facilitating quick turnaround. Cannon's tavern ledger recorded both legitimate tavern expenses and coded entries, FO4, FO8, R15, representing fees for procuring fugitives from specific counties. Each code corresponded to a client who expected human chattel ready for sale. In a single month, Cannon's gang might dispatch a coffle of 40 individuals bound down Pennington's Creek, while dozens more vanished from homesteads whose owners never reported the losses for fear of retaliation. Violence was routine. Captives who resisted faced beatings in the barnyard before they were marched. Some were whipped into obedience. Others shot if they attempted escape. Johnson was said to keep a deerskin whip studded with oyster shells to leave jagged scars. Rumors persisted that Cannon personally administered poison to those she deemed too troublesome. Husbands who refused marriage advances, witnesses who threatened betrayal, even rival slavers who encroached on her territory. Arsenic, concealed in flour sacks or served in morning coffee, eliminated competition and silenced potential leaks. The combined brutality earned her the sobriquet, the Queen of the Reverse Railroad, a chilling inversion of the freedom-seeking network that guided fugitive slaves north. The multi-racial composition of the Cannon-Johnson gang posed a conundrum for law enforcement. Northern officials initially dismissed Philadelphia press accounts as abolitionist exaggeration. Southern planters, meanwhile, blamed itinerant dealers from Georgia or New Orleans, uncomfortable implicating their own neighbors. Only when free black activists pressed lawsuits against county sheriffs did the charter for an inter-state manhunt emerge. In 1828, the governor of Pennsylvania authorized a detective to coordinate with Maryland authorities. But even then, the task proved daunting. Informants were scarce, witnesses terrified, and Cannon's network accustomed to operating in the marshes, where waterways shifted and boundaries blurred. The gang's couriers delivered messages by coded knocks on tavern doors at odd hours, and safe houses depended on chain of custody protocols that mimic plantation hierarchies. Owners, drivers, overseers, only no one asked questions about the origin of their human cargo. By the time Patty Cannon and several low-level accomplices were finally arrested in late 1829, the gang's operations had already waned under pressure from abolitionist vigilance and strengthened anti-kidnapping statutes in Delaware. Over a dozen prosecutions took place, but only a handful resulted in convictions. Johnson escaped capture, presumed to have fled west with forged papers, while Cannon, laden with arthritis and weakened by years of harsh living, died in prison before her trial could conclude. Never was full justice served for the nearly 3,000 men, women, and children ripped from safety to endure the brutality of the Deep South's plantations. The legacy of the reverse Underground Railroad endured, however, as a grim counterpoint to the heroic narrative of secret passages and Quaker allies guiding freedom seekers northward. Communities along the Delmarva Peninsula bore the scars of distrust and grief for generations, memorializing missing loved ones in church records and oral histories. Historians estimate that the networks dismantled or repurposed by Cannon's gang later served abolitionist causes, as some escaped slaves turned their knowledge of secret routes into vital intelligence for those fleeing bondage. Yet the dark calculus remains. At least 3,000 souls were commodified by a multi-racial cabal led by a woman whose very name came to signify the cruel inversion of liberation. Their stories, of homes shattered, families dispersed, and freedom perverted, remind us that evil can arise wherever fear and profit combine, that the distance between hope's beacon and a trapdoor can be measured in the turn of a lantern's flame, and that every promise of sanctuary carries the risk of betrayal when men and women bend justice to the dictates of greed and racial oppression. At first glance, any wary traveler might have considered Patty Cannon's tavern a sanctuary. Its rough-hewn planks were polished smooth by years of footsteps, the warm glow of oil lamps and cedar smoke promising rest from dusk's chill. The scent of fresh, baked cornbread mingled with the tang of cattle, and hay carried in on farmhands' muddy boots. Free black families fleeing coastal plantations and solitary runaways under false passports passed beneath her low doorway, drawn by the promise of cheap lodging and honest work. Cannon greeted each with a measured sweetness, an outstretched hand and a courteous invitation to supper, knowing full well that kindness, more than fear, built the unshakable trust she depended upon. Under the roof beams, she entertained stories of harrowing journeys northward, of bloodhounds lost in swamps, of Quaker sympathizers near the Pennsylvania line. She nodded sympathetically, tracing the lines of hardship in her customers' faces, then dispatched an eager servant to fetch blankets and extra all. After plates of salt fish and skillet, fried plantains had been cleared, she would invite her newest arrivals to step down into the basement, cellar, and inspect provisions stored for winter. Subterranean chill clung to rough brick walls, a handful of lanterns hung from rusted hooks, and wooden barrels of pickled turnips lined one corner. She let her guests handle sacks of flour and sugar before quietly shutting the trapdoor above them. Below, ensconced behind a false wall that swung silently on hidden hinges, lay iron shackles bolted into stone. Men and women who had glimpsed hope were bound there in darkness, the echo of pattering feet fading as Cannon raised the hatch, her final promise a soft whisper that freedom lay north or south, just beyond their reach. In truth, the promise was a lie, one she repeated with practiced precision. Rest now, and by dawn you'll be on your way to new beginnings. Instead, she left them to grope for imagined doors and to whisper prayers to the rafters. Morning light filtered weakly through a small, high-set grate. Captives groped the damp floor for fragments of straw to sit upon, pressing palms to the cold brick as they recalled the warmth of hearths left behind. Mothers thrust comforting arms around children who did not yet understand betrayal, and men cursed the thief of their liberty until throats ran dry. Every shackle clanked with subterranean irony, binding ankles once fresh with hope. More than a dozen victims, sometimes twice that number, would occupy the cramped space at once, breathing shared air choked by the stench of fear. A thin crevice between two barrels let in scant air, a single bucket served every occupant, passed hand to trembling hand without ceremony. Above, Cannon counted the hours until her gang's departure, scribbling coded notes in a ledger by lamplight. 12 for Mr. Beasley, 7 for New Orleans, each numeral tallying bodies she planned to commodify. When the convoy assembled, Cannon herself supervised the marchers as they were bound in coffles, heavy chains linking wrists to ankles, fastening strangers into a human chain of despair. The patriarchs of stolen hamlets marched at the front, their stripped hats clutched with dignity, footsteps echoing on the tavern's threshold before stepping onto the rutted dirt road. Behind them followed women clutching infants, their shawls flapping against shackled irons. Children, coherent or weeping, trailed tethered by ropes knotted around tiny waists. A pair of deputies, cowardly farmers bribed with silver, herded the group with whips and shouts, eyes flicking to the tree line for predators or abolitionist spies. Locals watched from gnarled fence posts, some pretending neutrality, others offering sympathetic gestures before stepping back into hollows to warn friends and kin. The route threaded along old stagecoach tracks, passing the moss-hung church where a Sunday sermon preached mercy just weeks earlier. Cannon's line traversed creeks bridged by crude wooden planks, each crossing echoing with splintering crack. At farm fords, gang scouts dipped iron buckets into the water, offering a cup to captives whose parched tongues risked the sting of riverborne insects and muddy silt. A few tried to slip loose from the chains, only to be beaten back by deputies' blunts, harsh commands thrown like stones until bodies crumpled beneath boots. Any attempt to flee invited immediate retribution, news swinging from the nearest oak, a public lesson in powerlessness. By dusk, the coffle reached the edge of tidal marshes where sloops waited at creaky piers. Cannon had negotiated secret docking fees with local chiffons. In exchange, she guaranteed them the richest human cargo any trader could procure. The moonlight silvered pelicans roosting on pilings as the captives were loaded onto flatboats. Men first, pressed standing in waist, deep bilge water, women next, clutching toddlers overhead. The tide carried the craft out into open water, where the hush of night swallowed insect calls and the distant croak of frogs. Below decks, slave traders in broad, brimmed hats scoffed at the seasonings hastily tossed into crates of codfish, unboxing the new arrivals, striking price bargains by lanternfuls of flickering wick. Sale negotiations unfolded at clandestine landing points, piers where sacks of indigo and barrels of rum changed hands alongside flesh, every head counted, every limb inspected, teeth condition, muscle tone, scars from failed escapes. Ship manifest was doctored to read, barrels of pork, where human figures lay hidden, each name replaced by letters and numbers corresponding to Cannon's ledger's shorthand. Brokers in imported wool coats snapped neckties as they appraised the living cargo. A man in his prime might fetch $500 at the Alabama exchange, a mother with toddlers, $200 to $300. The proceeds were tallied under the watchful gaze of Cannon's agents, who pocketed the difference between reported and actual sales, their pockets lined with crisp bills from the New Orleans market. Back on shore, Cannon collected her share, half of the gross profits, smiling as she tucked the bills into a lockbox beneath floorboards. The other half was laundered through her tavern's nightly takings, payment for room, and board padded the count, ensuring local constables remained content with their share of the spoils. Under the bed in her private chamber lay a small scale and money bag, ready to weigh gold dust and silver coins smuggled from distant exchanges. The clatter of coin confirmed the success of each venture, even as her victims wailed beneath ocean waves or trudged through pine stands toward unknown fates. Word of the coffles spread along rumor lines, chilling nearby towns. Free black lodges posted missing person bulletins at Philadelphia docks and in Trenton marketplaces, appealing for aid to northern vigilantes. Quaker networks dispatched envoys to investigate, but patrolmen in Delaware counties greeted them with polite indifference. By the time a formal manhunt coalesced, Cannon's gang had vanished across county lines, reassembling weeks later under new leadership and fresh false papers. Their methods remained unchanged, promises of safe passage, clandestine basements, binding chains, nocturnal marches, and river crossings, until abolitionist fervor and strengthened laws in 1829 forced the final collapse of the ring. Yet for every captor brought to justice, dozens of records disappeared into county archives, burned or misfiled by fearful clerks. Families left behind carved memorial spirals into gravestones for loved ones never returned. Songs were composed, sung low by lantern-light laments for the stolen, hymns promising that freedom's bell would one day toll for those still chained. In taverns along the old route, travelers still pause at broken milestones, wondering whether the faint echo of manacles might yet cling to the wind, an enduring reminder that promises masked as hospitality can lead not to safe harbors, but to distant auction blocks, and that the cruelty of human greed knows no bounds nor borders. Rumors swirled around Patty Cannon's tavern, almost from the moment she took control of it. Stories whispered in the hush of dawn among fence sitters and traveling peddlers. None was more chilling than the tale of her first great betrayal, the slow, silent poisoning of her own husband. John Cannon, a weathered carpenter with roving tastes for drink and brawls, had purchased the old Delmarva Tavern as a joint venture with Lucretia Hanley. He financed the renovation, talked up the pub's prospects, and left the day-to-day operations in Patty's capable hands. She thanked him in public with a gracious smile, and in private with arsenic stealthily stirred into his morning coffee. Within weeks, he complained of stomach pains, bouts of vertigo, and dizzy spells that left him grasping for a chair. Neighbors said they heard him retching outside the stable at midnight, yet Patty tended to him like a dutiful wife, offering poultices and soothing syrups. When John finally succumbed to a mysterious wasting fever, his death certificate attributed it to decaying organs, and nobody questioned the verdict. Freed from her husband's dependence, Patty seized complete control of the tavern's profits and its secrets. She inherited his few debts, his tools, and the ledger hinting at old smuggling routes she would soon expand. The landlord's lien on the property expired under her watchful eye, and by the next harvest season, she held the deeds in her own name. Townsfolk marveled that the once brawling carpenter was gone, replaced by a composed woman whose laughter now echoed in the taproom. It was the perfect demonstration of her philosophy. Wherever a rival might stand between her and power, she uncovered a means to eliminate them. No one suspected a woman so mild on the surface could have orchestrated such calculated violence. As the reverse Underground Railroad blossomed, Cannon learned that poison offered a discreet tool for silencing anyone who threatened her monopoly. Rival kidnappers and small-time slave traders operating on the Delmarva Peninsula soon discovered that meeting her in the Crossroads Tavern could be fatal. One such competitor, a wiry man known only as Sealer's Dove, turned up dead in a heap outside the kitchen door, his face frozen in agony. Cannon claimed he had drunk tainted cider and succumbed to natural causes, but neighbors whispered of a pale glint in her eyes as she instructed the cook to clean the glassware thoroughly. A week later, another man, this one a brash-up North slaver named Gresham, died amid gruesome convulsions after sampling Patty's peach preserves. Ballad singers later recounted how Gresham had hefted a jar to his lips, exclaiming, "Sweet as honey," before clutches of muscle spasms racked his frame and he fell across the bar. When poison proved too indiscriminate or slow for the task, Cannon resorted to more overt brutality. Rival gangs that attempted to muscle in on her routes found themselves ambushed at the river fords or in the dusty crossroads outside her tavern. Stories describe men seized at dawn by masked figures and hurled into the river with their hands bound, tossed until they drowned beneath the swirling current. Others were felled by blunt instruments, long barn hooks swung with practiced force, splitting skulls to ensure no rival could rise to challenge her again. These acts of violence were never chaotic or vengeful. They were surgical strikes, designed to instill terror in her network of associates and warn outsiders that the bounds of her empire were sacrosanct. The mere rumor of her involvement was enough to silence dissent and keep intruders at bay. Cannon understood that fear could be as binding as chains. In one notorious incident, she hosted a gathering of captains who transported enslaved people by schooner to southern markets. They convened after sunset, sipping brandy and discussing contracts under the rafters of her tavern. Cannon apologized for the dampness in the cellar, an excuse for the absence of her hidden cells, and offered them a toast to prosperous ventures and safe journeys. Her glass gleamed beneath candlelight as she raised it high. Hours later, the captains were found sprawled on the floor, their breaths shallow and labored. One lived long enough to whisper, "Poison," before slipping into unconsciousness. Over the next day, each man died in turn, leaving her with a congregation of dead bodies that clients would never again question. Their ship sailed empty that season, and no captain dared seek revenge. Besides arsenic, Cannon experimented with rare toxins gleaned from local apothecaries and coastal botanists. She learned of nightshade berries from sailors back from the Caribbean, and extracted their deadly alkaloids in secret vats hidden beneath her husband's old workshop. With these extracts, she could build a recipe that mimicked dysentery or cholera, slipping it into water barrels or soup pots. When large groups of kidnapped people threatened to raise alarms by deteriorating all at once, she doctored only select meals, using coded riddles in her ledger to indicate which rationed batch contained the poison. Complaints of stomach cramps and fever among captives were chalked up to poor winter diet or overexertion. The few enslaved men and women brave enough to resist were dismissed by overseers as weak. No one traced the sickness back to the hand that stirred their broth. Her use of poison extended beyond property seizures and rival dispatches. She also turned it against municipal officials whose scrutiny threatened to expose her ring. County clerks tasked with recording slave registrations received sealed letters inviting them to inspect Cannon's records. When they arrived, they found the ledger open, quill ready. A cordial note inside instructed them to begin with the red ink entries, which corresponded to her most valued guests. Those officials left with sudden illnesses and blank diaries, their quills splintered and ink replaced by memory holes. Sheriff's deputies who attempted discreet inquiries found their horses collapsing on midnight rides, their boots slicked with a poisoned ointment applied to the stirrups. The law, when it came for Patty, often arrived only in hearses or hearsay. Despite the mounting casualties, Cannon maintained plausible deniability by cultivating local superstitions about hauntings and curses. When men died suddenly, she signaled to neighbors that the tavern was haunted by vengeful spirits, perhaps those of runaway slaves who had perished in the basement. Lantern-bearing vigilantes patrolled her grounds. Spooked by disembodied moans, she timed to echo through the rafters. Occasionally, she invited itinerant preachers to perform exorcisms on her property, all the while slipping the ministers a generous fee and a sly wink that the true exorcist was the jailer down below. Such theatrics diverted suspicion from her true methods, making any inquiry seem superstitious. Even the most reputable investigators found themselves questioning their own senses amid the tavern's fog and shadows. Yet none of her opponents could match the scale of violence she orchestrated. When word of her husband's suspicious illness spread, she deftly fed the gossip mill with half-truths. He'd once sampled a brew laced with poisonous mushrooms, she insisted, or fallen victim to a family curse laid by an enslaved conjurer. These tales grew within the community, morphing into legends delivered on front porch gossip. Thus, her most personal murder slipped from scrutiny, even when medical examiners in neighboring counties began to suspect foul play by comparing death certificates, several attributing sudden sicknesses to unknown toxins. They lacked jurisdiction to collect evidence from a private residence. The county coroner's inquest convened and adjourned with no definitive findings, leaving Cannon free and above reproach in the eyes of most locals. It was only in the late 1820s, when abolitionist networks and free black home guards grew bolder, that someone dared to map the pattern of unexplained deaths across Maryland and Delaware's quiet roads. They noticed that each mysterious poisoning or drowning traced back to patrols passing near Cannon's Tavern or relying on her ferry services. Investigators pieced together testimonies of apprenticed servants who described vats of white powder in the basement, of burlap sacks labeled meal, tucked beside nightshade clusters. These accounts named Cannon herself as the mastermind, though the accused woman's reputation for kindness made such charges feel impossible. Interviewed neighbors spoke on condition of anonymity, scared of the Queen of the Reverse Railroad, whose wrath they knew was fatal. Even as travel warnings circulated, posters depicting a stern woman in a faded lilac dress, finger pointed like a judge, the violence continued unabated. Cannon's gang shifted operations southward, recruiting new lieutenants and expanding into Delaware's quiet back roads, all under her direction. When one lieutenant balked at the murder of a local postmaster, he vanished from his bedroll one dawn, left only with a spiraled chalk mark on his chest and a smear of soot tracing the shape of a cross above his collarbone. Rumor held that Cannon meted out this death herself, as an object lesson in obedience. Her control relied on the knowledge that any oath of secrecy could be enforced by a silent, lethal whisper at the nape of the neck. By the time the official manhunt reached its peak in 1829, Cannon's cruelty had become legendary. Even low-level accomplices who testified against her begged for clemency rather than stand trial, certain that others, those who survived, would pay in kind. Her death in Sussex County Jail, likely by suicide or slow poisoning of her own, marked the only time she tasted the vengeance she so freely administered. Yet long after she was gone, her methods remained a blueprint for terror. Basements were dismantled, hidden rooms bricked up, but the lore of her poison and violence endured in lullabies of fugitive mothers and in the cautionary verses passed among child laborers. Her lethal legacy became a spectral force haunting the crossroads of Delmarva, a reminder that power, unchecked by conscience or law, breeds cruelty bound only by the limits of human ingenuity. Within months of the reverse Underground Railroad's most brazen kidnappings, the scandal had ignited a political firestorm in Philadelphia's gilded hallways and Pennsylvania's marble-lined corridors of power. The mayor of Philadelphia, John Swift, a stern but reform-minded Whig, received private petitions from abolitionist societies pleading for decisive action. Across the state line, Governor John Andrew Schulz was barraged by appeals from Quaker assemblies and free black elders demanding protection for citizens whose very freedom had been stolen by a criminal gang rooted in Maryland's eastern shore. By 1827, the mounting public outcry left both officials no choice but to launch a manhunt unparalleled in scale. A coalition of Philadelphia detectives, Pennsylvania state militia troopers, and Delaware sheriff's deputies was formed, bound by promises of shareable bounties and a political imperative to root out the gang's ringleader, Patty Cannon herself. Under orders direct from Harrisburg, a detective squad known as the Liberty Task Force was assembled, drawing skilled investigators such as Ezekiel McCall, a former newspaperman turned constable renowned for his interrogations, and Amos Garrett, a militia captain respected for his frontier expeditions against smugglers along the Susquehanna. Garrett's men were drilled in midnight raids that would rival any Southern slave patrol, sworn to approach Cannon's Tavern on Maryland's back roads with minimal fanfare and maximum prudence. Meanwhile, McCall combed through abolitionist directories in Philadelphia, cross-referencing reports of missing persons against shipments leaving Chesapeake ports. Each clue was to be communicated through coded letters carried by trusted escorts on horseback, a network designed to outpace Cannon's own courier ring. With every passing week, the task force expanded southward. Constables in Delaware were deputized, and county magistrates in Caroline and Dorchester counties were quietly pressured by the governor's emissaries to cooperate or face censure. The operation's first planned raid, slated for a moonless night in March of 1828, brought Garrett's mounted detachment to a quiet hollow near Cannon's Crossroads. They approached her tavern's rear kitchen door, expecting to surprise captives locked in the hidden cellar. But mere moments before Garrett's whistle could sound, a solitary lantern winked on inside the tavern's parlor, as if signaling an early warning. 3 mounted riders spurred from the lane, firing warning shots that shattered the stillness and drove Garrett's men to scatter into the woods. Garrett returned to Philadelphia with bruised pride and empty saddlebags, convinced that Cannon's network must include informants within even the governor's inner circle. At the political level, Governor Schulz's patience wore thin. In letters to the state senate, he castigated the brazen defiance of law by a single woman and her accomplices, urging swift passage of tougher anti-kidnapping statutes. Philadelphia's mayor, too, used the city council podium to decry local complicity and to call for municipal detectives to pursue abductors across state lines. Though Pennsylvania's constitution technically forbade police action beyond its borders, the legal ambiguity was skirted by deputizing Maryland officials under oath to act with Pennsylvania's authority. Philadelphia's Common Council funded the Liberty Task Force through extra appropriations hidden within street cleaning budgets and dog licensing fines. McCall and Garrett reported directly to a 3-man oversight committee in Harrisburg, receiving daily dispatches from Delaware's crime commissioner, Thomas Jessup, who coordinated informant testimonies and managed a network of sympathetic tavern owners along the Nanticoke River. Despite this outpouring of resources, Cannon evaded each attempt at capture by a combination of guile and intimidation. Her mastery of local politics allowed her to bribe just enough officials to throw the task force off her scent. She paid county clerks in Caroline and Dorchester with hush money. Small envelopes of silver $half slipped across the courthouse bench that ensured all warrants bearing her name vanished into desk drawers. When Delaware's solicitors requested records of land transfers tying her to the Old Hanley Tavern, a forged deed arrived at the office, signed by a supposed relative in Pennsylvania, listing the property under an alias. Messengers who carried news of the raid's failure were waylaid by masked riders in thick fog, found later unconscious beside the road, their sealed orders torn to shreds and bound together with strips of pig intestine. Such acts of violence cowed many would-be informants, convincing them that discretion was the smarter course of action. Meanwhile, the intimidation turned bloody. In Sussex County, Maryland, a meaning farmer named Ezekiel Turner agreed to shelter a free, black man James Ruffin, who had escaped a gang's trap. Turner and Ruffin wrote letters to Delaware's authorities, detailing Cannon's methods and the layout of her hidden cellar. The next morning, Turner's barn was in flames, his horses burned inside their stalls, and Ruffin was nowhere to be found. His body was later discovered upstream, bound to a millstone and weighed down in the creek. The news froze the Liberty Task Force in its tracks, for who could prosecute a murder committed by unseen conspirators in a jurisdiction reluctant to investigate white on black violence? Governor Schulz's dispatches to the state's attorney general grew more strident, yet the manhunt faltered without credible testimonies. Despite such reprisals, abolitionist newspapers kept the pressure on. The Pennsylvania Freeman and the Christian Recorder ran scathing editorials condemning both Patty Cannon and the local officials who shielded her. They published detailed maps of her known routes, printed lists of missing persons' names and descriptions, and offered rewards of up to $200 for her arrest. But time revealed that mere posters could not overcome Cannon's web of corruption. Every time a mounted patrol ventured south, a bungled warrant or a tip overheard in the Pine Barrens alerted her long before the posse arrived. Garrett's militia captains complained of a phantom militia, men in borrowed uniforms whose shots and echoes mimicked the Liberty Task Force, sowing confusion and delaying genuine hunters. In Philadelphia, the mayor's office convened endless sessions with the city solicitor and external legal counsel, debating whether to issue an interstate arrest warrant that would bind Caroline County sheriffs to hand over any suspect. The council argued that the extradition treaty between Pennsylvania and Maryland required conclusive evidence, which local juries were unlikely to provide in a case marred by racial prejudice. Attempts to secure testimony from freedmen in Philadelphia were doomed. Those who came forward disappeared into unknown detention or returned with threats from Cannon's agents, their families intimidated by anonymous notes left on their doors warning of the next lantern swing. Public frustration boiled over when the mayor publicly admitted that the end of an hours extended, even within the shadow of our own state lines, a rare acknowledgement of law's impotence when met by organized, cross-border crime. Back on Delmarva, Cannon sat in her tavern parlor each evening. The Liberty Task Force's wanted posters plastered beneath her mantle like prize targets. She ran a ledger by lamplight, tallying the gang's coffle shipments coffles that totals exceeded 50 souls in a busy season, each earning her an estimated $1,000 in southern cotton states. Her smile in each journal entry revealed a woman confident that her empire remained safe from legislative reforms and police orders alike. She invested her wealth in gunpowder and ferry improvements rather than land, ensuring her ability to move captives swiftly by river, bypassing muddy roads tracked by bounty hunters. Her gang's lieutenants were reissued new aliases and sent north on false passports, then funneled back through safe houses in Delaware and Pennsylvania that posed as Quaker benevolence networks. By the time Mackall caught wind of a fresh human shipment bound for Baltimore, he was too late. The captives had vanished from a dock at midnight, and the Liberty Task Force could only retrieve broken chains and discarded shackles. As 1828 waned, frustration gave way to scapegoating. Governor Schulz directed the Attorney General to pursue low-level accomplices, stable hands, ferrymen, tavern cooks, anyone with a surname that matched Cannon's ink-coded ledger. Dozens were arrested and brought before juries in Dover and Wilmington. Evidence consisted of hearsay, partial ledgers, and the testimony of terrified townspeople. Many of these defendants confessed under duress, hoping to wrangle lighter sentences by cooperating. They named each other and sketched rough diagrams of the hidden cellar beneath Cannon's floor. Yet when the trials commenced, local judges dismissed key witnesses as unreliable. Juries comprised of white farmers and merchants saw no reason to convict neighbors for the alleged kidnapping of free black folk, a crime too easily dismissed as rumor or reconciliation of runaway slaves. By the spring of 1829, most low-level conspirators received token fines or short jail terms, and their names were quietly expunged from courthouse records when debts to bail bondsmen were paid off. In the end, no direct link could be legally established between Patty Cannon and the abductions, murders, and sales that bore her stamp. The Liberty Task Force recorded dozens of leads, but never produced sufficient evidence to indict her on charges more serious than contempt of court. The mayor of Philadelphia, while furious at the failure, praised his detectives for diligent pursuit in the face of fearsome opposition, and Governor Schulz convened a special commission to study interstate law enforcement gaps, an early precursor to federal anti-kidnapping statutes. But those reforms would languish in committee for years. Cannon, meanwhile, continued her operations unimpeded until a chance burglary by a desperate outlaw leaked the existence of her Delaware cellars to a Pennsylvania minister. By the time authorities mustered the will to act on this information, Cannon had slipped south into obscurity, leaving behind a trail of destroyed records, frightened witnesses, and a criminal dynasty that thrived on the very laws meant to stop it. Thus, despite a manhunt described in newspapers as unprecedented in its ambition, Patty Cannon evaded justice through a lethal cocktail of intimidation, bribery, strategic violence, and legal loopholes. The actual prosecution netted only minor players, the foot soldiers whose coerced confessions filled dusty transcripts, but never reached the lady of the manor herself. In every court docket, her name was conspicuous by its absence, a stark reminder that in a society riven by racial prejudice and factional politics, the richest rewards often lie beyond the grasp of law, and that the architect of 3,000 stolen lives could walk free even as lesser accomplices claimed the blame for crime she commanded with impunity. Within weeks of the final raid on her Delmarva stronghold, Patty Cannon's fate was sealed by the very network she had long eluded. A desperate tip from a former convoy driver, haunted by memories of chained captives and nocturnal river crossings, led Delaware constables to the hidden cellar beneath her tavern in October of 1829. At dawn, with mist slithering through the marsh grasses, a contingent of mounted deputies and Philadelphia detectives encircled the weathered building. Cannon's usual sentries were gone, scattered at word of the manhunt, and when the trapdoor swung open, they found dozens of starving men, women, and children tangled in iron shackles. Amid the rescued captives, Sheriff John Price turned a lantern on Cannon herself, seated calmly at her kitchen table, fingertips stained with ledger ink and refusal in her pale, steely gaze. They placed her in leg irons and marched her through townsfolk gathered at the crossroad, faces a mixture of relief and stunned disbelief. Newsboys shouted bulletins, church bells tolled erratically, and the local paper printed her name in headlines that spoke of Mistress of the Reverse Railroad captured. Her trial would be the most sensational event the Eastern Shore had witnessed in decades. Yet first she had to be transported 50 miles north to Sussex County Jail in Georgetown, where state-line juries still honored swanky Maryland elites who tried to buy their way free. Cannon's journey across bridge and ferry drew small crowds along muddy roads. Some spat curses, others watched in morbid fascination as the woman whose cruelty had terrorized free black communities passed beneath trestle arches and across wooden causeways. Sussex County Jail was a squat brick building built in 1817, its iron-barred windows casting long, black shadows in the lamplit corridor. Cannon, used to dictating terms at her own hearth, found herself stripped of both agency and status. The jailer, a grizzled veteran of coastal smuggling pursuits, clanked her once proud ankles into shackles attached to a wall ring. He offered her a single blanket and a crust of cornbread. She accepted without gratitude, her eyes narrowed against the dank stone damp that leached into her bones. Word of her arrival spread through the town's taverns and bakeries, and clusters of curious onlookers pressed against barred gate-posts, hoping for a glimpse of the woman who had turned hospitality into a slaughterhouse for liberty. Preachers seized on her incarceration as proof of divine justice, while abolitionists whispered that her demise would only stand as a hollow victory if the courts failed to deliver full reckoning. Inside her cell, Cannon sat on a simple plank bench, her skirts hiked above cold ankles, fingernails bitten to the quick. At night, the wind rattled the locked shutter, and rats scurried across the floor, nipping at crumbs. Detectives summoned her twice daily to a backroom interview chamber, flanked by lantern light and stacks of ledgers they'd exhumed from her burned down cookhouse. They pored over her coded sales records, matching them against slave manifests at southern ports. Each figure, FO4, R15, D22, spoke not just of shipments but of human lives carted through deplorable flashpoints where swamp and shore converged. Cannon listened in silence, letting the inked pages echo their accusations without response. When pressed, she offered only an inscrutable smile, as if daring the men to unmask the truth behind her poker faced calm. Through barred windows, she watched lawyers and clergy shuffle in to consult with her. A Quaker emissary arrived bearing petitions from Camden's freedmen, begging her to name the families she had torn apart, so that survivors could claim reparations or at least locate lost kin. Cannon replied in clipped sentences, "My ledger speaks for itself. I am neither mother nor savior." A row of jail matrons, women deputized to prepare her meals and mend her tattered shift, later recalled that she addressed them by title, never by name, as though she still expected to command respect. Yet the knitting needles they offered to while away her idle hours lay untouched. She preferred to trace spirals in the dust with her forefinger, an echo of the signature she once carved in suit beside, "Return." As November wore on, the legal wheels began to turn. Formal indictment papers arrived, charging her with multiple counts of kidnapping, murder, and conspiracy to traffic humans across state lines. Each charge carried a potential sentence of death by hanging or life in the state penitentiary at Philadelphia, at a hearing before Judge Samuel Hopkins, appointed by Governor Schulz himself. Witnesses came forward. A weeping farmer who described finding his hired hand shackled in the tavern's damp vault. A freedman whose infant daughter had vanished under Cannon's escort. A bedraggled sleuth from Philadelphia who held forth her faded certificate of freedom, its official seal identical to the forgeries Cannon had peddled. The gallery overflowed with curious citizens and families broken by her schemes, each bearing the weight of her deeds in hollow expressions of grief and rage. Despite the mountain of testimony, Cannon insisted on her innocence with a composure that unnerved even hardened prosecutors. In the glare of courtroom lights, she fixed jurors with a stare that seemed to bore through their affidavits, whispering as if to herself, "I did what I must to claim my birthright." Some spectators claimed she spoke of omens and birth rituals, proclaiming that the blood taxed on her property was fate's burden to be borne by any who defied her. Historians later speculated she was weaving a mythic defense, casting herself as a progenitor of harsh frontier justice rather than a criminal. But as the weeks of pre-trial motions dragged on, the strain showed in her gaunt cheeks and the tremor of her right hand when she signed a subpoena. Even adversaries conceded they had never witnessed such a mosaic of fear and defiance in a single person. On the eve of her trial, the jail's corridors hummed with electricity. Blacksmiths forged fresh chains to secure her cell. Clerks filed dozens of motions challenging extradition protocols. Ministers visited early that morning in the hope of granting her last rites should the court deliver a guilty verdict. Cannon, meanwhile, sent for a small leather pouch from her bedding, extracting a piece of yellowed paper with the spiral motif she had once left as a calling card. She traced its curves slowly, lips moving in a silent hum reminiscent of the lullabies she had once twisted into instruments of despair. A jailer peered through the peephole to find her kneeling by the threshold, clasping the paper like a talisman against the dark forces closing in. When the jury reconvened next day, the courtroom was filled to overflowing. Victims' families lined the benches, abolitionist societies in starched suits perched in the gallery. Reporters fanned themselves in the heat of anticipation. Prosecutor Montgomery rose, voice ringing with righteous indignation, and laid out the full litany of Cannon's crimes, just as he delivered the final count. Kidnapping a free woman named Rebecca Miles, mother of 3, an anguished cry split the chamber. The bailiff darted toward the back door. Moments later, a jailer burst in, his lantern flame quivering, bearing a covered form. Cannon lay slumped in his arms, lips ashy, eyes glazed with resignation in an expression that chilled every eyewitness. She was still wearing her prison shift, the undone laces of her bodice falling aside like a confession of vulnerability. Medics summoned from the county infirmary declared her death by apparent poison, noting a dark residue on her tongue and a small vial of arsenic tucked inside her shift's folds. No hanging rope was found. The spiral of her final release remained unknown. Some whispered she had swallowed the last of her forbidden extract gathered from Caribbean nightshade, choosing her own fate rather than stand condemned in open court. Others believed a fellow inmate had slipped her the fatal dose in a final act of sabotage. The Rev. Lionel Ames recorded in his diary that he administered the sacrament too late, crossing her heart with oil and uttering last prayers in a chamber now bearing the widow's peace. Officially, the coroner's jury returned a verdict of suicide, insensible to the law's authority, a finding that outraged the families whose lives she had upended. Grieving mothers thrust forward petitions demanding full inquest. Local newspapers decried the outcome as cowardly evasion, and a chapel sermon preached on the sin of those who would murder themselves to dodge justice. Yet in the months that followed, the legal files grew silent. With Cannon gone, her low-level accomplices received lenient sentences or saw charges dropped for lack of a living ringleader. Court clerks confessed to burning her incriminating ledgers in the jail's furnace, fearful that their iron smokes might waft across the town. Her tavern sat empty, windows shuttered, its basement bricked up and barred for good measure. Locals told tales of her lantern ghost drifting through the front parlor, beckoning late, night wanderers into corridors where cell doors groaned on unseen hinges. Families of the disappeared carved faded memorial spirals on tree trunks where they once camped in hopes of intercepting her coffles. Decades later, archaeologists unearthed fragments of iron shackles and shards of South Carolina rum bottles beneath the floorboards, silent relics of the lives Cannon had trafficked. Yet no box of writings, no final ledger page escaped the flames, leaving only accounts in fading ledgers and oral testimony to pin her legacy between fact and legend. In the end, Patty Cannon's story closed not with a hanging, but with a hush so profound it echoed along every tidal creek she had once used to harvest souls. Her death prevented the jury from pronouncing any formal judgment of guilt, and her disappearance from court records left her a phantom queen of unpunished horrors. But for the communities she had terrorized, from Caroline County farmsteads to the cotton fields of Alabama, the conviction of her cruelty stood unshakable. They carried forward songs, prayers, and legal reforms that honored those she stole, forging an enduring testament that even when evil slips beyond the scaffold, its victims demand remembrance, and true justice is found in vows to never forget the names of those who vanished in the night.